hello to also the people that are with us online. I know we have students from some of our classes that are viewing our first Global Education Colloquium of the quarter today. We're very happy to welcome Dr. Sharon Wolf with us. She is an applied developmental psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania in the School of Education, who studies how children's family and educational environments shape their development, focusing on disadvantaged populations in both the US and in developing countries. Her work informs interventions and tests the effectiveness of theoretically informed policy solutions designed to promote childhood development and learning through randomized field experiments. Prior to being at the University of Pennsylvania, she was a postdoctoral research scientist at Global Ties for Children Research Center at NYU, and also a National Poverty Fellow with the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We are very happy to have her with us today, and she's going to talk to us about some work that she has been doing in Ghana, and I hear there's going to be like a glimpse of some very recently collected data too. So anyway, Dr. Wolf will talk for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll save for the last 20 minutes for questions from the audience and then also from online. Okay, so welcome.
Good. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and thanks for coming despite the beautiful weather outside. I'm very jealous of all the people I see walking around without jackets on. So thanks for spending this hour here with me. And I'm going to share about a project. This has been ongoing for about 3.5 years. That's a joint partnership between many people. So I actually want to just start by acknowledging I'm here presenting to you, but there were so many people and have been involved. Including Innovations for Poverty Action, which is a nonprofit research organization that brings together policymakers with academics to bring rigorous research to bear answers on some of the key questions that different ministries within governments are thinking about, including education, but not only. The National Nursery Teacher Training Center, which is a teacher training center in Ghana that was our implementing partner for all of this work. The Ghana Education Service, which is within the Ministry of Education, and then Saber Education, which is a nonprofit that's doing a lot of work in early childhood education in Ghana and was part of our program development team. And then we have a bunch of funders and my co-investigators, Larry Aber at NYU and Jerry Bierman, who's also a Penn. And then obviously the teachers, head teachers, caregivers, children who are part of this study who gave us a lot of time over the past few years. So I wanted to give a little bit of background on early childhood education. I'm not sure, I think this is a group with different focal areas and different interests. So the work I do is primarily focused in these kind of early pre-primary and early primary years. And children's early and behavioral and social skills have lasting consequences for their schooling trajectories and also their outcomes in adulthood. Most of the evidence we have comes from higher income countries, but it's not limited to that. Some really interesting work in North Carolina found that teachers' ratings of their kindergarten students' social and behavioral skills predicted a whole set of outcomes in their early adulthood. So they linked these children with administrative data and controlling for a whole set of factors. They found that these early behavioral and social skills, as rated by teachers, were related to adult earnings, education level, marital status, and also criminal activity. And so we know that these skills form a foundation for children that really have implications for their longer term outcomes. In terms of academic outcomes, early literacy and numeracy skills, also that we have quite a bit of research showing that they're strong predictors of later schooling outcomes, again controlling for a whole set of other covariates. And because of that, economists have done a lot of work to look at the potential return on investment in early childhood education and have estimated that for every dollar invested in quality early education, and quality is really a key word here, that returns to society are estimated between $4 to $10 for every dollar. That's a pretty good return on investment. So, and I mentioned quality, and that is key because actually poor quality early education, actually there's some evidence to show that it could be harmful for kids. It would be better for them to be home than to be in a poor quality center-based care or early educational care. So as early childhood education programs are expanding around the world in regions all over the world, we're seeing increases in enrollment in pre-primary education. We don't know a whole lot about the quality of these programs. And this is really a key issue. And so the work I'll talk to you about today is about strengthening quality at the systems level. How we define quality is a big question, and I'd love to talk about it at the end if people are interested. But one key dimension of quality in early education is really the emotional climate, the social and emotional climate in the classroom. Children at this age are developing key foundational skills around social and emotional development, executive functions, and so the emotional climate of the classroom can help with that adjustment and that foundational building, or it can hurt it. So it's really key for learning. So as I referenced, early childhood educational participation rates are on the rise globally. Sub-Saharan Africa as a region has the lowest. About 1 in 5 children are enrolled in some formal early educational experience. Ghana is an exception. Ghana actually has higher enrollment rates than we do here in the US for preschool children, at about 3 out of every 4 children. And the reason for that is partly comes from parent demand, but a lot of it comes from a policy that was passed in 2004, the National Early Childhood Care and Development Policy, that laid out a bunch of priorities for investing in young children. And one was to develop 2 years of pre-primary education, which is called kindergarten, or KG1 and KG2. And in part of this, they also developed a curriculum for the kindergarten sector. And what's really interesting is the curriculum was very different than, it was really an intentional to try to make kindergarten and pre-primary education different than the primary education system in Ghana, to make it more hands-on, to make it more child-centered, with an explicit aim for schools to engage parents in their children's learning. So quite different than how the current kind of status quo of schooling is in Ghana. And in 2007, this expansion actually happened. So 2 years of pre-primary education, kindergarten 1 and kindergarten 2 became part of the free compulsory basic education system. In 2012, the Ghana Education Service did a report. It's been 5 years since they did this expansion. They wanted to see how things were going, kind of sector analysis. And they concluded that the curriculum that they established was sound. They wanted teachers to use this curriculum, but it turned out nobody was. Teachers hadn't been trained in it. So despite having passed it on paper, they gave it to schools, teachers never really received support to actually integrate it into their practice. And a lot of teachers, because the expansion happened so quickly, a lot of teachers had actually no formal training at all in education. So the key priorities coming out of this report were first to train the untrained teachers, and they estimated that there were 27,000 of them untrained in what they called KG-specific pedagogy, kindergarten-specific pedagogy. And the second priority was to engage parents in schools and also raise their awareness. We heard in talking to teachers before this project that part of why they don't use it is because they would get pushback from parents. The parents really value education and see rigorous academics as really the key for their children learning and succeeding in school, and so they would want the classrooms to look, the way they do, with much more teacher-directed. In Ghana, it's interesting, private schools have to comply with the national curriculum and standards. That's not the case in every country. And 4 out of every 5 new schools being built in Ghana is a private school, so we're seeing exponential growth. So we wanted to make sure that in the work we did, we also included the private sector. So I'll tell you a bit about that. But first, I actually wanted to just play you a 30-second clip. We were lucky enough to get this project covered in a podcast by NPR, and so we have a lot of videos that I can't show you because for privacy reasons, but I can play you a little clip to give you a glimpse at what some of the classrooms look like that we were trying to work with. So you're going to hear the NPR reporter, you'll hear my voice, and then you're going to hear Margaret Okai, who's the Director of Basic Education at the Ghana Education Service. She was one of our key partners within the government.
You walk into one of these classrooms, you find 2-year-olds sitting at desks in rows. It's a very serious environment. There's no toys, no windows to look through. And the teacher holds up picture cards.
Shoo! These preschools have basically just become extensions of primary schools. A lot of rote memorization. I don't say shoo! 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 Shoo!
We called up the official in charge of Ghana's elementary schools, Margaret Okai. She says most preschool teachers in Ghana, they don't have any training.
Sometimes when you enter their classroom, you realize that they are not able to engage the children.
They fall back on how they learned in school, with lectures and memorization.
And talking.
All I say is nose. 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 Show me your nose.
Now, this class of 2-year-olds is on to Roman numerals.
I stand for 1. I stand for 2. I stand for 3.
So you get a little picture that children seated in rows in ways that, at least from what we think we know from developmental science, aren't really that conducive to learning, especially for younger children. And as you heard Margaret Okai say, most of the teachers, because they don't have formal training, they just fall back on what their schooling experience was and they replicate it. And it's very reasonable, right, that that's the case. So the government had a different vision for the kindergarten sector, and that's where we came in to work with them. So we partnered with the Ghana Education Service. The National Nursery Teacher Training Center, which I mentioned, is one of the main places in Ghana you would go if you wanted to get training in early childhood education, and Innovations for Poverty Action. And we wanted to help them with their 2 key priorities, to develop a model for teachers and also for parents to raise parental awareness around these new methods to ultimately improve quality and ultimately improve children's school readiness. I have nationally scalable here in italics because that was really at the center of everything we were designing. We didn't want to create something that worked great but could never be used again after the study. We wanted to work within all of the existing both district and national education government structures with existing teacher training centers, so that should we find that we are onto something that could really work, it could continue after the study ended. So with NNTTC and also Sabre Education, which I mentioned at the beginning, we developed 2 main parts for this intervention study. The first was the kind of the key part of the program, the teacher training. Oops, sorry, it's going on a timer somehow. I don't know how to stop that. I think it's going to move again. Well, okay, so the training was designed. We know a lot from education science and teacher professional development that teachers who come for training, sit for a few days, go back to their classroom, and never get followed up with again are very likely to actually integrate any of these new approaches. Has anyone here been a teacher in the past? Has anyone participated in those types of professional development opportunities where even if you decide you want to try some of these things, as soon as you encounter challenges, you don't really have anywhere to ask or get support? So we knew that we learned from that. We didn't want to do that again. So we worked with NNTTC to change this 8-day training into a 5-day training with 3 refresher days. So at the beginning of the second term, teachers came back for refresher trainings, and then they came back at the end of the beginning of the third term again. The teachers also got in-classroom coaching and monitoring. We also know from mostly research in high-income countries, but not only, that the best way to really change your pedagogical practices is somebody in the classroom watching you, giving you feedback. And so we worked with the district education coordinators. Actually, it was their job to go and monitor teachers, but they saw their role more as one of monitoring and accountability, to try to catch the teacher if he or she wasn't in the classroom or wasn't doing the right thing. So they actually attended the trainings with the teachers, and then they had their own trainings about how to be coaches and how to be what we called critical friends. And so they paid the classroom visits, but they kind of changed the nature of what those visits were. And also often they weren't doing these visits because they weren't getting reimbursed for their transportation costs, which they were supposed to be, but they weren't. So that's the one kind of intervention in the system that we did, was to reimburse them for their transportation costs. This is just to give you a little very glimpse. We can come back to this. I don't know why that keeps happening. At what the training covered, the kind of key areas, but anyway, we'll come to that if you have questions. So the second piece was the parental awareness training, and this is not a parenting training. It wasn't about parenting practices. It was about raising awareness of these new practices, the kindergarten pedagogy, and also how parents can support the role of learning. Parents, many of the parents that we spoke to and that as we heard from NNTTC and from the government, the parents really saw education as the teacher's job. It was their job to get the child to school fed and clean, but the learning happened in school. So we basically created these videos. We worked with a local media company and a local early childhood education expert, and we created these scripts and we made these 3 videos that covered 3 topics. One was around how young children learn and the role of play in learning for younger children. The second was around what parents can do to support learning at home. Even if parents don't have a lot of education themselves, for example, they could ask the child to count the number of tomatoes that they brought home from the market, or to point to all the green things that they saw around them. So really practical things. And then the third was to encourage parent-teacher communication. That parents and teachers, parents can actually ask teachers how their child is doing, can actually have a relationship with the teacher related to their child's education. So those were the 3 themes. They were implemented by the district education officer, the same one who did the coaching visits. And they happen once per term at all the PTA meetings, the Parent-Teacher Association meetings, which every school has. Okay, so we wanted to then know if these programs worked. So we evaluated them with a randomized controlled trial. We worked in the greater Accra region of Ghana. There's 10 regions in Ghana. We worked in this one because the teachers had to be within a 2-hour drive from the training center so they could come for the training every day. So we were mostly in peri-urban and some semi-rural communities. We sampled public and private schools, and then we randomized schools to 3 conditions. The first was a control, where they just did whatever professional development they planned, whatever else they planned. We just came and collected data. The second was, the second group of schools received this teacher training and coaching program. And then the third group got the same program plus these parent engagement meetings. Are people familiar with randomized controlled trial methods, with experimental methods? Because we randomized schools, we're then able to compare groups because the only difference across the schools is which treatment they receive. So the way I'll then share the impact results with you is going to be everything kind of relative to the control group, which is what would have happened had no intervention occurred. And we were in 240 schools, 444 teachers, and about 3,400 kids. So it's a pretty big study. We checked for balance at baseline, so we did feel comfortable that our randomization worked and we could really compare the 3 groups in the experimental framework. So as I mentioned, ultimately we were interested in kindergarten fulfilling its potential to help children develop those key behavioral, social, and academic skills so they could be ready for school. Part of the reason the kindergarten sector was expanded was because children were entering primary school not ready to learn. So that was kind of our key outcome. But we wanted to know if it worked, why, and if it didn't work, why not. And so we wanted to look at those key things related to the classroom and to the teacher that we think would have to change for children's school readiness to ultimately improve. Classroom quality, I'll tell you how we measure that. And then we also wanted to look at teachers' professional well-being because there are very high rates of turnover, specifically in the kindergarten sector, probably for similar reasons that we might think happen in this country, lack of professionalization, pay is low, teachers aren't really generally respected, and so there's very high rates of turnover and what some have called a motivation crisis. So we wanted to look both at professional well-being and if teachers stay in the profession longer when they are given professional development. And then, so we test each of these kind of separately, these 2 different treatments. So before I move on to the impacts, are there any questions about the design or the theory of change? Okay, so let me tell you what we found. So we collected a lot of data. I'm presenting some of it to you today because these were our kind of key primary research questions. But if you think about the theory of change, we were really interested in classroom quality, and that was really defined as the nature of teacher-child interaction. So how is learning being conducted in the classroom? How are teachers and students engaging? We know those are the key drivers of learning. So having a nice classroom and nice desks and toys and books, those are only helpful to the extent that they help improve those interactions in the classroom. So we were really looking at that, but we also wanted to first see our teachers implementing any of the practices from the training. So those were the 2 elements of the classroom we looked at. We videotaped all the teachers in our sample, and then we coded those videos. We also did teacher surveys and collected school administrative records if teachers were not there at the end of the year to look at attrition. And then we did direct assessments with children, and I'll tell you what measures we used in as I share the results with you. So we looked at impacts during that first year of implementation at the end of the school year. It was a 1-year program. We were lucky enough to have funding to go back a year later and follow the kids and the teachers. So we ended up with a longitudinal study of teachers and a longitudinal study of kids to see what happens a year after the program ends. And then this summer we just collected another round of data on the children as they're now in primary 1 and primary 2. So we can look 2 years out if their gains are sustained. So we can talk about this later. I just wanted to share the analytic strategy that we accounted for the fact that this was a nested structure, right? We sampled schools, and then within schools we sampled teachers and classrooms, and then within classrooms we sampled children. So we look at impacts, we account for that with 3-level models for child outcomes, 2-level models for teacher outcomes. We had a small set of covariates from baseline, and then we also, as with most longitudinal studies, we had some attrition. They were not huge. We lost about 14% of the sample of kids over the 2 years, and a larger chunk of teachers. So we imputed all that data, and we also ran sensitivity checks with and without the imputed data. So we can talk about that for anyone who wants to know more about the analytic strategy. So implementation. We coded these videos, and we wanted to see were teachers doing the things that were part of the training. So we had a checklist of 15 activities. These are just some examples of things related to behavior management, which was a key part of the training. Using more positive and proactive behavior management rather than reactive, which often the teachers kind of resort to because they didn't have many other tools to use. So during this video, did the teacher at any point praise the children for positive behavior, explicitly remind children of the class rules? Part of the training was to develop class rules with the children and then remind them of those rules throughout the day. This is red because it was reverse coded. Did the teacher threaten children with or use a cane? At least once during the video. We saw a lot more of that than we thought we would, given that teachers were being videotaped. And then we had a set of instructional things. So again, these were just things that were part of the training. Did the teacher use a circle time activity during the class where all the kids were participating and could see each other sitting in a circle? Did the teacher use a game? Did the teacher use found items? Materials were a big issue, so part of the training focused on how you can create learning materials out of everyday things that you might find. Did the teacher ask at least 2 open-ended questions during the class? And this is just some pictures. This is an example of using found items as learning materials. You can see bottle caps as counters. You can see cardboard, cutting out cardboard so children can move numbers around as they learn math. This is an example of a circle time activity. Okay, so were teachers doing more of these things, right? So I'm going to show you first at the end of that first school year. So what we found was, yes, they are. The orange bar is the control group. TT is teacher training, and TTPA is that other teacher training plus parental awareness condition. And we see that in both treatment groups, teachers are doing more of these things. Okay, these are effect sizes of about 0.6 standard deviations. So our first question, okay, they're integrating some of the things from the training. Okay, so the next question is, does that actually result in improved quality when we think about teacher-child interactions? So we coded these videos using the TIPS. Has anybody heard of the TIPS, Teacher Instructional Practices and Processes System? It was developed by a group of researchers at NYU. Specifically, it's based on similar principles as the CLASS. Has anyone heard of the CLASS, the Classroom Assessment Scoring System? Anyone who does classroom observation research in the US, that's kind of the gold, considered the gold standard. It's assessing different dimensions of teacher-child interactions, but it was adapted for use in low-income countries, and specifically actually in sub-Saharan Africa. The first TIPS was developed in Uganda, and we did a bunch of adaptation work in Ghana with it. It's 19 items. We didn't want to assess impacts on 19 items. That's a lot, and you might just by chance find some impacts if you do that. So we conducted an exploratory and then confirmatory factor analysis, so we ended up with 3 domains of quality. First was what we call facilitating deeper learning. These are maybe instructional strategies. You might have heard that term before. Things that teachers are doing to really try to deepen children's learning. So scaffolding, giving high quality of feedback, turning feedback into a learning opportunity. The second was what we called emotional support and behavior management. So this was related to the climate of the classroom. Was there a positive climate? Was there a lack of a negative climate? Some have both. Are the teachers sensitive to the children's need? Is the teacher using an appropriate tone of voice? And then all the indicators of positive behavior management loaded with that factor. So climate and emotional support and positive behavior management really seem to go hand in hand in these classrooms. And then the third, which we called supporting student expression, which I think was probably the biggest shift. If you think about that little clip I played you, where students weren't really asked to think or express themselves, it's much more about repeating. So this was kind of the biggest shift, getting students' ideas to be considered in the classroom, encouraging reasoning and problem-solving skills, making connections of the classroom to everyday life, so really helping students be more central in their own learning process. So we look at impacts on these three domains, and from now on, actually, the way you're going to see impacts is just going to be two bars. The green, which is teacher training, and the blue, which is teacher training plus parental awareness. And everything is relative to the control. So if there's no changes, the bar is here at 0. If we see positive changes, it's above the line. Negative changes is below the line. And these are all in effect sizes. These are derived from those multi-level models I showed you. So when we look at facilitating deeper learning, these are not different from 0. There's no impacts. There's no changes on teachers' ability to facilitate deeper learning. We do see positive changes of about 0.65 standard deviations when it comes to the domain of emotional support and behavior management. Our theory of change was that these might be larger, and when we engage parents, teachers might suddenly have more support from parents and from the community to implement some of these practices, but we see no differences between the two treatment arms here. Here's our first puzzling finding. When we look at supporting student expression, right, this is kind of the biggest change we were hoping teachers would make, we see positive gains from the teacher training intervention. When you engage the parents, that goes to 0. So something about engaging the parents led teachers to not start doing this, not support student expression. We'll talk a little bit about why later, why we think. But that's our first sign. Something didn't go as we thought with that intervention. The second area we looked at is professional well-being. We did teacher surveys. For the sake of time, I'm going to speed through the measures, but I'm happy to talk about them for anyone who wants. So you're going to see the same impacts here, presented in the same way. I'll put them all up. So the only place we see some changes, but the only place where they're statistically different from 0 is burnout, and here we want negative changes, right? We want less burnout. Burnout is feeling emotionally exhausted, mentally drained from work, and we see that in both, these are not different from each other statistically, so in both groups we see a reduction in teacher burnout just from getting some training and coaching in the classroom. And then the other element was related to attrition. I was maybe shocked at the amount of teachers who were gone by the end of the school year when we came to collect data in the spring. So we saw large reductions, and these were larger in the private sector. So this is the private sector showing you the predicted probability of turnover. In the control group, it was more than 40%. And this was not that surprising to the school head teachers, but it was higher than we expected. And you see that just by receiving training and coaching, that goes down by about 45%, the probability. There were no monetary incentives as part of this program, so it is really remarkable that when teachers are invested in, they're much more likely to stay. Okay, we then wanted to see, do these changes in some of our key mediators, some of them were changed, do we then see changes in children's overall school readiness? So we looked at 4 domains: literacy, numeracy, social and emotional development, and executive function, those key some of the key social and behavioral foundational skills. We use IDELA. Again, for the sake of time, I won't go into the measures, but we can do that in the Q&A if you're interested. So I'm going to show you impacts on the overall composite of school readiness and then break it down so you can see if any particular domains were driving these changes. So another puzzling finding. Teacher training, we see positive gains. These are small, but these are kind of of the magnitude of what we see in most intervention research, school-based. 0.16 standard deviations. Add the parent engagement, that's counteracted completely. That's basically 0. So engaging the parents meant the children did not end up getting those gains that we see in the teacher training group. We broke it down by domain, and we see that these impacts are actually driven, they're really coming from all the different domains. They're statistically significant in literacy, numeracy, and the largest in social and emotional development. These are things like emotional identification, conflict solving skills, empathy. So something about the nature of the classroom was improving both social, emotional, and also academic learning. These are not different from zero, so all of those are basically zero when you add the parenting group. Okay, so what do we see when we come back a year later? So that's all in the first year. We wanted to see, first, are teachers still maintaining these changes? And what we see is, yes, there's that checklist, remember that checklist of activities? They're still doing more of those, but the impacts are about a third of the size that they were the year before. So they're maintaining some gains, but not others. And then here's the kind of puzzling piece. None of these are different from zero except for supporting student expression with the teacher training and parent awareness condition. Now it's negative. So teachers are not only not doing that, they're actually doing less than the control group. So, we think something happened between the teachers and the parents that really caused teachers to pull back, and in a pretty major way, once the coaching and support was gone, they really seemed to counteract the training in that way. What about the children? So we followed them a year later. They're now in new classrooms with new teachers. Almost all of them were with new teachers. And we saw that a year later, this is again overall school readiness and then numeracy, literacy, social, emotional. The main gains that are sustained are in social and emotional development. So they're still outperforming their control group peers in that area. Now, we went back, I just told you we collected some data this past summer, and we followed the kids that are now all in primary school. They have all new teachers, and we collected data in the same domains, but we now use new assessments because the kids were older. We needed to adapt to their developmental changes. And so we looked at the same domains, so early numeracy, literacy, social, emotional, executive function. And then we also asked their new teachers to report on their social competence. We use the social competency scale. And we see that their new teachers are reporting them as more socially competent than their peers. But we also see now these larger gains in literacy emerging of 0.2 standard deviations. And we still see these sustained gains in social and emotional development. So, and marginally significant gains in EF. So it's interesting to see that they seem to still be doing better than their peers in the teacher training condition only, 2 years after the intervention. Okay, so what happened with the parenting program? So when we were analyzing the first year results, we were really puzzled, and we thought we better get back over there and talk to some of the teachers and parents while this is still fresh in their minds. So we went back and did interviews with teachers and caregivers. The caregiver interviews didn't really tell us much, but we heard a little bit from some themes from teachers. The first was, they were actually really the same. So one teacher says, when topics were discussed, some of them did not agree. They were like, I gave birth to my child, so why shouldn't I beat him if the child is misbehaving? So some pushback around some of these different practices around behavior management. Perhaps parents felt that this was not a good thing for their children, that actually this was an important way to teach different social and behavioral norms to children. Another teacher said something similar, like getting the child some learning materials. They asked, what did you discuss in the training? And the teacher says, getting the child some learning materials so that they're playing, they can be learning at the same time, and sometimes they have to stop using the cane. But a parent voiced out and said that her kids are stubborn, so without the cane. So I told her that with some parents, they said the kids are always happy whenever they're around, so they should avoid the cane and they'll be fine. And I think maybe this was the behavior management was what we heard about, but perhaps parents were worried in general about some of the new methods that their child might not learn. We didn't have the evidence to tell them actually your child will learn more of their letters and numbers. If your teacher uses some of these practices, we couldn't tell them that at the time of the intervention. We also did some subgroup analyses, and this is children's overall school readiness from the teacher training parental awareness condition, broken down by if the household has a male head and if the male head is literate or not literate. And we see that most of those negative counteracting effects are coming from children in households who have a male head that's not literate. So it's perhaps the kind of male heads who were not literate, who felt most worried about some of the changes, who might have pushed back the hardest. And then we see that this was pretty concerning to see negative impacts. And so we're rethinking this and taking this pretty seriously. So our next step is going to be actually much focused more on qualitative data collection, to try to understand more from parents who they get their information from, how they make decisions about schooling, and try to think about more successful ways to engage them in their child's early learning. It's very clear that parents really want what's best for their child. So it's trying to understand kind of how they make those decisions and how we can frame things in ways that actually can help them see that their kids are going to learn more if teachers use these methods. We're working also with the Ministry of Education was really interested in how this could be adapted in rural schools where it's harder to reach teachers. The coaching happens even less frequently because it can take a whole day for some to reach some of the teachers based on where their school is. So we're thinking about maybe developing some e-coaching, kind of using the same content with e-coaching. There's a recent study that just came out showing e-coaching was just as effective as in-person coaching if there was an initial in-person training. So, and also a qualitative work to try to understand what teachers think is important and what's in quality in early education, and see if we can kind of incorporate some of that into some of the trainings moving forward. For children, we also, in addition to following them into their primary schools, we collected a ton of data on their classroom and primary school context. So we can look at if sustained gains might be larger if they entered a better quality classroom, or if there are different types of homes. So we'll be looking at kind of moderation of those sustained gains 2 years later. But I just want to, so I'll quickly conclude and share some of what the implications for policy that we've been discussing with the Ministry of Education. But this was one of the first impact evaluations in the region to show that something brief and actually built within existing government structures can actually improve quality at the pre-primary level and children's developmental outcomes. We think the refresher trainings and coaching visits were really important to that success, at least for the teacher training component, and this is consistent with what we know from research in other contexts. Similar to the effect sizes, like there have been a bunch of reviews recently looking at effect sizes of interventions for teacher trainings in early education, and they tend to find kind of these medium effect sizes, about 0.6, 0.7 on teaching practices, and then these smaller impacts, 0.1, 0.15 on child outcomes. So, we might need to think a little bit harder about what else would need to change so we could see larger gains for children. We also did a cost analysis, which is obviously critical. We think about scale up or replicability of the results. And we've been sharing these with the government and also with the World Bank, who funded some of this work, to think about where some of this money could come from if we were to do this on a larger scale with more schools. Our estimate that it's about $400 per teacher when we take all the kind of time and resources into account that would be required to do this. Okay, so my last slide is some things we've been talking about with the NTC, the National Teaching Council in Ghana, is that in general we think they should be structuring their teacher professional development in ways that have ongoing reinforcement with refresher trainings, and potentially to work with the district education staff to provide ongoing feedback. So they're interested in trying to kind of structure professional development moving forward in this way, not just for the kindergarten sector. The second, which I think is interesting, we usually don't have a whole lot of evidence to see what happens to teachers a year or two later after trainings that we think are successful are over. And the fact that teachers continue to use some of the activities, but then other aspects of quality actually decrease, highlights the importance of the monitoring, the coaching, but also the need for ongoing professional development. There's a tiny study in the US that showed teachers actually followed teachers over a few years who were part of this professional development program. Teachers who received 1 year of training were no longer using the practices 2 years later. Teachers who received 2 years of training were. So this kind of idea that maybe 2 years really needs to be the minimum for if we really want to see transformational change in teaching. And then the last is that we should not assume we're going to have positive impacts if we engage parents. I think a lot of the assumption is that it's always a good thing, and we don't think hard enough about the approach maybe that we take, or how parents are interpreting the messages of different trainings, and also who's delivering them. Looking back, and from the few meetings I attended, the district education coordinator, I don't think was the right person to deliver these messages to parents. They actually, parents did not connect with them. I think in a very hierarchical society, they were kind of seen as higher in the hierarchy, and I think they saw themselves that way when they engaged with parents. So we're rethinking a lot about, and the qualitative work will help us to really understand who parents get information from, who do they really listen to, and how can we work within those kind of networks to try to disseminate some more of that information. And there are some promising approaches actually happening in Ghana on a much smaller scale, so we're working with some of those organizations to think about next steps. So that's all I have, so thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So thank you for like a very interesting and full of information presentation. And I'd like to open the floor up both in person and online for questions for Sharon.
So many. So what is the, I am in America, in the United States, early childhood education is financially so unattractive that we have not attained anything that's even statewide for our preschool, kindergarten. We're all over the board educationally. What is the economic advantage, disadvantage? Are they on the same plane as other teachers in the middle and high school levels? So what does that look like structurally with teachers in Ghana?
So a few years ago, actually, the Ministry of Education decided to pay all of its teachers a good salary, like a decent salary, no matter what level they're teaching at. And actually 95% of their budget goes to teacher salaries now because of that. So
that's why you're using bottle caps to count now.
Oh yeah. So well, here's the issue, right? Well, I don't know where all that money is.
Yeah.
Many of the teachers that I talked to had not been paid in a year, 2 years. I met a teacher who had been paid in 3 years, public sector teacher. She's still coming to work every day, which is amazing. And on paper, that when they say that there are paperwork issues, and when it gets sorted out, the teachers will get back pay. All the teachers I talked to, that was not happening. The private sector is totally different. I mean, they get paid very little, and that's why there's very high rates of turnover.
So
they're much less likely to have education beyond secondary high school, much younger, much less experience. So we actually looked at differences in the public and private sector, and we saw like the reductions in burnout and turnover were much larger in the private sector. Those teachers get very little investment in their professional development, and this really seemed to make a difference, at least for those two outcomes. But in terms of the impacts on classroom quality, child outcomes, they were the same in both sectors. It's part of the basic education system now. So it kind of the financing comes from the same sources as for primary school. So it's part of how they've been so successful at getting so many kids enrolled, and on-time enrollment too. So yeah.
I have a question. So because when you're speaking about the curriculum change, even at the primary school level, at the pre-primary level, it made me think of curriculum reform in China, where I do a lot of my work, where there was a push to actually change primary school education to make it more student-centered, more hands-on, using manipulatives, all these types of things. And so I have sort of two questions about whether you saw these things transpiring in Ghana. I mean, one, I was wondering about the overall system of education in China, because in Ghana, because in China there's a lot of pushback from parents, because once the children left primary school, they were going to the reform didn't reach China, and so parents were worried, well, they're going to spend their time in primary school doing all this stuff, and then what's going to happen when they end up in this very rote exam-driven system in middle school? So there was almost like a failure to think systemically about what happened in education. And then also teachers felt like even with training that they didn't have like just the background knowledge to answer questions, that they felt intimidated by teaching them this learning style. So there was a lot of pushback from teachers, even separate from the parents. And so I was just wondering about systemically what the next step was in Ghana, and then two, in your discussions from teachers, did they express any reservations about moving in this direction?
So the teachers loved the training, actually. We got really positive feedback from them. I think because they were able to actually see the changes in their classroom and they had a wider toolkit of things to use. I don't think these ended up looking like Montessori classrooms where a teacher was completely child-driven and the teacher was fully supporting. I think it was really, at least from the videos I've watched and the classrooms I've seen as part of the study, it was, the teachers were able to kind of change only to a certain, they were able to integrate some more of these practices into how they were teaching. But there was still a lot of teacher-directed instruction. There was still rote kind of learning, and I think there is a place for that. I don't think that's a completely bad thing. But they were able to take enough of these kind of ideas and integrate it into what they were doing that it seemed to really change enough of the classroom that children were learning more. I think the transition from kindergarten to primary school is actually a really important next step and issue. A lot of we have a steering committee that was helping us throughout this project, and they said that children are really scared of transitioning to primary school because there's just a lot more use of corporal punishment. It's a much stricter environment, and that actually they were worried that this would make that transition even harder as kids are in more emotionally supportive classrooms to then go to a much more strict environment. That's part of what we'll look at when we look at the sustained gains and how the classroom environments in primary school may have moderated that. I think part of the pushback from parents was related to that like, well, how my kid needs to learn these letters and numbers that they're not going to be able to do well in primary school otherwise. We didn't get that pushback from teachers quite the same way. I worked on a parallel study at the same time, which was trying to integrate similar things into pre-service training, because there are a few colleges of education that offer certification in kindergarten. And teachers got this intensive training. There's also with Sabre Education during their student teacher year. We saw these huge changes in how they were leading their classrooms. And then they were then placed across the entire country in regular schools as newly qualified teachers. And we followed them a couple times over the year, and all the impacts, they tried to sustain them and they just faded. By the end of the school year, they weren't doing any of these things anymore. And they told us that the head teacher told them not to do that. The head teacher was like, I don't know how to evaluate you when you're using this was a lot of free play and a lot of maybe more what we might think of as much more child driven. And the parents pushed back quite a bit. So they're realizing the Ministry of Education and Sabre Education, there has to be a more systematic level of reform. We can't just try to change it here and then expect teachers to go out and be able to use these tools. So we're now thinking with them about doing trainings for head teachers and parents to kind of sensitize them to some of these practices. But it's definitely an important issue. I think because it's pre-primary, there's a little bit more space to consider that something different could be done. I think if we were trying to do this in primary school, it would be harder. Yeah.
There was a slide that you weren't able to cover, which was, I think, the curriculum. I
can go back to that.
I wonder if it'll stick now, because it would be interesting to see if you could walk us through maybe for 2 minutes just those topics. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just to give you a flavor. So, I never set those. It's so weird. I never set those, but let's see. Maybe I'll just have to get out of PowerPoint mode. Stay. Okay. No, it's not. So I'm just gonna get out of PowerPoint mode and I'll pull it up here. Can you see? Okay. So these are the kind of five.
I'm sorry, it's not on the screen.
Oh. It's still not. I don't know how to get it back on.
I think it's over on the side, like.
Yeah, it's not on my screen.
Function
though.
F8,
Well, I can tell you about them. So day one was focused on, so this was really interesting. There was a lot about how children learn and a lot about kind of the science of early childhood education. And actually they did some training on early brain development. And the teachers, this really stuck with the teachers around that it's actually, you can't learn when you're scared. That actually the parts of your brain, I'm not a neuroscientist, but the parts of your brain that can take in new information get kind of blocked when fear is elicited. And that seemed to really sink in for teachers around the use of corporal punishment and their behavior management strategies. So there was a day focused on that, how young children learn best, how do you create a child-friendly environment, that's actually helpful for children to be able to be seated in groups and see each other. What does a child-friendly classroom look like? So that was kind of day one. Day two was about managing classroom behavior, and there was a lot of a focus on classroom management, this idea of avoid, anticipate, respond, repair. So kind of really giving them different tools that they can use around having the classroom rules. How can they help children anticipate what's next? That's going to help them manage their impulses. And then there were 2 days, one focused on integrating teaching language and literacy, but integrating activities and games into that, making it a much more hands-on. Reading books, storybooks, an emphasis on, and if you don't have storybooks, on storytelling. Mathematics was similar. And then there was a day on assessment and planning. So teachers were really they had no idea where kind of kids were in their classroom, because many of them had big classrooms, not all of them. But so this idea that they can actually do formative assessment to try to assess where kids are and how can they meet kids where they are and kind of tailor learning in certain ways based on the different needs of children in the classroom. And then the refresher trainings focused on, teachers actually, the classroom coaches asked teachers kind of where they were struggling, and then we talked to the coaches and we used that to inform the refresher trainings. So that was the core content that was then reinforced throughout the year.
Thank you.
Sorry I can't show it.
No, that's fine.
Who were the coaches? Were they other teachers from Ghana, or were they from the group that you brought?
They were district education staff. Every district has an education ECE coordinator, and then other staff that work that are called education coordinators. Most of them are former teachers who've now moved kind of up in the education system. Yeah.
We have a question online.
Yeah.
This is from Joni Cohen. She says, I had a question about the responses/reaction of the parents.
Mm-hmm.
Are you able to pinpoint what things the parents do not agree with, or which things they are sending different messages about?
It's a good question. We're not. So we did actually collect a lot of data with the caregivers. We did surveys. We asked them about their disciplinary approaches, their perspectives of what makes a good quality classroom. We used different scales in early childhood. The kind of cognitive stimulation they're engaging in with their kids at home, there was no impacts on anything we measured. So that was unfortunately not very helpful in us kind of, the qualitative work ended up focusing a lot on the behavior management piece. The teacher that you saw a picture of at the end, the last slide, she was in the podcast, and she talked a lot about a father who came and said, my child is not learning, I want you to lash him. So the idea that the lashing and the corporal punishment will help children learn. I think that might, I don't know if we kind of saw echoes of that in some of the qualitative interviews. But that's the best we can pinpoint, because most of the data we collected was not pointing to, unfortunately, to what, to helping us understand that. I do think implementation did not go as we planned. So I mentioned that I did see go visit a few of these, and the district education coordinators did not implement them as intended. So it's possible that, that something, and again, we can't capture variation of that. We plan to collect a lot of data on the implementation. We had miscommunication with our implementation team. We didn't end up getting that data. So we're left mostly with a bit of a puzzle.
I have two methods-oriented questions. And so the first is that I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about whether the control group actually ultimately received any services, and just sort of the ethics involved a little bit when you do a randomized controlled trial with a type of intervention that benefits someone. And then two, I was wondering about the videotapes of the lesson. So were those randomly selected moments? How did you decide when they were going to get videotaped? Did more than one person code the videos?
Yeah.
Just speak to that as well.
Sure. Wait, sorry, your first
The first
question
one was about the
methods.
control group.
Yes, okay, so thank you. So there are a lot, as we were doing this work, we realized there were lots of different organizations trying to train kindergarten teachers all around the country. So, we did not tell them to stop what they were doing. We let the control groups do whatever they were planning, and we also gave them a little bit of materials for their classroom as a thank you for their time. And then at the end of the training, we gave all of their teachers a resource packet which has the manual. So we told them that at the end of the training, we'll tell you if this worked, and regardless, we will give you all the materials for having been part of the study. And actually, NNTTC is now offering the condensed 8-day training as part of. They were in the past always had 8-week courses, and they had committed, if we found that this was effective, that they would offer the shorter training for teachers of their center. So we, it turns out a few control group teachers came to the training. It was a mistake, I guess, on our part, but we kept, in terms of, we did an intent to treat analysis. They stayed, we treated them in the control group. So, we thought, we didn't know if this was going to work, and from an ethical perspective, and if you don't know it's going to work, it's kind of, you need to test it first before you can say we should give this to everybody. So I think for some programs it can actually be unethical not to test them. Like, we'll see what we found with the parenting intervention, how we've done that all over the country. We might have actually really had some bad, national implications. So we definitely tried to compensate the control group at least a little bit, and we gave a little bit of airtime to all the teachers and head teachers for their time for participating in the surveys. So we did try to at least compensate the individuals, and then at the end of the study give the schools all of the material.
The videotapes.
The videotapes, yes, thank you. So we told the teachers that we were going to come in the next 2 weeks, so they had some warning. They didn't know what day we would come. And we always came in the first 4 hours of the school day, and we videotaped from 30 to 60 minutes. We just asked them to teach a lesson, and we had coders or enumerators who were in the back of tablets who recorded the classroom. It would have been much better if we could have gotten, 3 or 4 visits for the teachers. We only collected 1 classroom at the baseline and 1 classroom at follow-up, so it's a serious limitation. We had training coders was really, really challenging on the tips. Less than half of the people we trained passed the calibration criteria. So there's a whole kind of criteria of, they go through this training and they have to, then they have these kind of tests, these 3 videos, and they have to get within a matching score of the master codes. And so anyway, a lot of people could not pass it. It was really challenging. We had enough people to pass who basically coded videos every day for like 6 weeks. They would just sit in a room and code 5 or 6 videos a day. And then we did some reliability. So about 15% of the videos we had 3 people code, and then we could see how consistent they were. About 70% of the variance across all the codes were shared by video. So it's kind of like a kappa value of 0.7. So it was good enough. Yeah, so that's how we did it. There are definitely serious limitations to that. There is some interesting research on videotaping and kind of teaching practice, how it affects teaching practice. And what it concludes is that after about 10 minutes, teachers can't really fake anything much beyond 10 minutes. So we started coding at minute 5, and kind of the first few minutes were kind of getting used to there being a tablet recording them. And yeah, the other option you could do is go do live observations and have the coders actually do the tips on site in the classroom. But we knew we wouldn't have enough, we couldn't get enough people trained to be able to do that in 450 classrooms. So this was our compromise, yeah.
All right, that's great.
Okay.
All right, well, I think, we'll take one more
yeah.
question here in the back here, and then we'll wrap up because we're at 1 o'clock. Go ahead.
After the culmination of your research, are there any factors that you learned about that maybe if you had the chance to go back and do it, that you would implement into the research?
If I had a chance to go back, I would what?
Did you learn about any new factors that weren't considered in the original research that you would put back in had you the chance to redo it?
That's a great question. Definitely, the parenting intervention for sure. We would rethink that completely. And we are rethinking that completely. Part of the challenge was we were trying to find something that could be done at scale and easily scalable. So we thought videos or something you could give to any school to show, and discussion groups could be led. But I actually think a much more intensive approach is needed if you want parents to reconsider kind of some deeply held beliefs, like bringing them in for an hour 3 times a year and with no follow-up, and asking them to really try to think in new ways. I think we need a much more intensive approach for parents. And I think I would have had us be a lot more clear about what our goals were with the parenting intervention. We kind of thought, we just want to help get support for the teachers to use these programs. And so I think I would kind of develop a new theory of change for the parenting piece and try to design the program much more intentionally. and make it a 2-year training program for the teachers. And lots more too, which we could another time to talk about. So thank you.
Well, that's great. I want to thank Sharon for a really informative presentation and for fielding so many questions. Thank you. And then I also just want to remind everybody, particularly people online, to join us again next month. We'll be having the Global Education Colloquium on November 28th at this same time. And our visiting scholar, Jin Lee, will be presenting about rethinking cooperative education, expanding the Drexel model to Chinese universities, which will be a really interesting talk. So if we could just thank Sharon again and see you guys next month.